Hello, Linda. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to be working on some math. Are you excited? What a beautiful smile. Um, really, I hate to call this math, Linda, because really what it is fun with numbers. Okay. You will be able to use a calculator on the test. You can bring your own, but they have plenty of them. They'll just lend you. They would probably prefer to lend you one of theirs, to tell you the truth, because if you take a fancy one like this, you know, if if you were a math savant, you could program things in here. But that'd be harder than knowing how to do the questions. So I don't know. They're kind of funny about that, but they like it to have just a plain calculator, and they have them there. But I would take one anyway. I mean, they're cheap enough. You can buy one at the dollar store for probably 4.95 or something. Just make sure the battery's good. You don't want to go out halfway through. Okay, well, tonight we have 12 exciting and wonderful fun with number situations to deal with. And we might have a few other students logging on in just a moment. But we're going to go ahead and start anyway. My name's Rick Roller, and I'll be your game show host for this evening as we work through these 12 different examples. And hopefully you've received an email with those in them and you can print them out. But let's start with number one. That's a good place to start. Okay, so here's a situation where M has a home that has an appraised value of $380,000. If the assessment rate is 60% and the tax rate is 7 mils, what will the tax bill be at the end of the year? Okay. Now, there's two ways that they can increase taxes on you. Okay. One of them is they can mess with the mill levy. Okay. This one is 7 mils. A mill is 0.001. It's 1,000th. You have 100th, and then you go another space, it's 1,000. So it's 0.001, three spaces from the decimal. So 7 mils would be 0.007. Okay. That's helpful to know. Now, the two ways that they can tax you, of course, is they could increase the mill levy, like I was talking about, and that takes a legislative type thing, and it's just it's political suicide in some cases. But they could do that, and a lot of times we have ballot initiatives in Utah where they will say, well, we want to increase this 1/4 of 1% of a mill to help support a new school or to build a new library for the schools or whatever. So, and sometimes we get to vote on those initiatives whether we want to do that or not. And sometimes they just raise the mill levy. But if they wanted to raise your taxes, if this was your house, okay, they could increase the assessment rate, or they could increase the mill rate, or they could do both, okay, and you're going to end up with it. But in this situation here, we have an appraised value of 380,000. Now, the difference between an appraisal and an assessment is that the assessor's office does assessments and licensed independent appraisers do appraisals. Okay, and but they're similar, and they should be similar. And sometimes, however, uh, the assessor's office is a little bit more aggressive, and so they may figure, well, this house is worth $400,000, and you have an appraiser friend that already looked at it, or you did your own work and came up with, well, I think it's only worth like 380. And so there's one time a year. I mean, they come out in the fall with the current assessed valuations, and I mean, I live in Salt Lake County, and so this is quite large, and so the assessor's office doesn't have a big enough staff to do the entire county every single year. There's just too much, not enough assessors and too much work. So what they will do is they will look at every sale that happened, no matter where it is in the county. Okay, so they'll look at each current sale, but they won't. But they have the county kind of quartiled into four different areas, and so they work each quartile, once every fourth year. Okay. So that means if your quartile was done last year, they're not going to reassess you for this year. But if there was a sale in your neighborhood just down the street, they're definitely going to reassess that one. It's real easy. They're just going to take the full market value that it's sold for, which they will figure that out, and then they'll go from there. But on this one, the things we need to work this problem are we need to pull out some of the numbers. We don't care that it's number one, of course. So not every number is useful, but we do care about the 380, because that's the assessed value, or at least the appraisal rate. Now, the assessment rate is 60% and the tax rate is 7 mils, and that'll give us our tax bill. Now, like I said, they could increase the mill levy, but they could also increase the assessment rate. Now, the reason why there's an assessment rate, well, there's two reasons. One of them is political and one of them is practical. Okay. The political one is that voters tend to live in houses that they own. Not always, sometimes they live in apartments and things or a house that they may be renting, or sometimes they live in a mom's basement, but they're still voters. But a lot of voters, don't like paying taxes anyway, and so they're going to be against any mill increase unless it's, like maybe half a mill to build a new school or something. I don't know. They might go with that, but that the more you increase the mill levy, the more taxes you're going to pay, and that's split up for all different kinds of things and services and the budgets that the county or the city has that they need money for. So we have an appraised value, and then we have assessment rate. Now, the reason why there's an assessment rate is because, well, let's take Park City, for example. Park City has a lot of condos, and some are occupied by the owners, either on a part-time basis or a full-time basis. It doesn't really matter, but they're using that as a domicile. They come and they use that. Now, if they were renting it, they might get hit with the full appraised value on their assessment. But being political animals that run for political offices, they figured, well, gosh, we should give a break to homeowners that are living in their own homes. So there could be two condos right next door to each other in Park City area, and one of them they're used for nightly rental. That's going to be hit with the full 100% assessment rate. But they're going to give an owner-occupied or owner-used primarily property a 40% discount because they're voters. So that's kind of how that works. Okay, so sometimes if it's not used as a rental, you can get a lower assessment rate, which would give you a lower tax bill. Okay, because we're not taxing the full $380,000 at 7 mils, 0.007. Remember, 1 mil is 0.001. So this is what we've got. We've got the appraised value, we've got the assessment rate, which will give it to the assessed value times the tax rate, which will give us the tax due. Now you need to know that formula, AAATT. So let's kind of plug in our numbers and see how it works. So what we have here is first is the assessment rate. Well, the appraised value, which was $380,000, and the assessment rate was 0.60, which is the same as 60%. See the two little decimal circles and 60%? Well, you start on the far right and you roll out over 2. If it was 160%, it would be 1.60, right? But it's not. It's 60%, so it's just 60%. So they're giving you a little break. Maybe this is something that's being used as a residence and not necessarily a rental. And so they're only going to tax you on 60% of that assessed value. So the first calculation is just 0.60 times that. That gives you $228,000 was the assessed value. Okay. Now, like I said, of course, our mill levy is 7 mils, so it's 0.007. 007. Hey, how about that? All right, so we're going to multiply the $228,000 with the assessment value, as the assessed value, and that's going to give us tax due of $1,596. Now that's pretty easy if you're going from the top down, but a lot of the math problems you're giving, they'll start from the bottom and make you work back up. So they'll give you 1596 and they'll give you the mill levy, but they won't give you the assessment rate. You have to figure that out. Well, then you'd divide 1596 by 0.007. So if on the side over here, where on the left side of your screen, you see you have assessed value, assessment rate, assessed value, tax rate, and that tax due. And if you know that formula, then you can move it down, up and down and around. If you're solving for the bottom and you're going up, you're going to have to divide as you go up. But if if you just have the other values and you're going down, like we had in this problem, you multiply and there's your answer for you. It's not difficult math if you know your formula. You just need to have the formula to plug it in. So knowing these formulas will be absolutely critical. They're not going to give them to you. You have to know that. But it's fairly simple. The appraised value times the assessment rate. Well, why is there a difference between the assessed value and the appraisal rate? Well, like I told you, I mean, they want to be able to tax income producing properties maybe at the full assessed value, but since you're a voter and most voters don't own investment properties, many do, but most don't, and so they're not concerned about the other properties. Um, but if you're trying to run for office, you say, well, I'm going to lower the assessed value, well, or I'm going to lower the assessment rate, so anyway, that's kind of how that works. Any questions about this? Now, when the tax bills come out, they usually come out in late August, sometime in the fall, or early summer or midsummer or whatever. But anyway, they come out, and if you don't like what they put on there for their assessed value, you can challenge that. But you can only challenge it for about 2 weeks out of the year, and it's in right in that time of year when everyone's taking their vacations when the kids are out of school. I don't think they planned it that way, but it just works out that way. And so you might and there's a lot of people that will do this kind of work for you. Some of them won't charge you anything unless they get you a tax reduction, and some of them charge like $50 up front. But either way, it's kind of nice to have somebody that knows what they're doing, uh, not in the city or county. I mean, I'm talking about independent appraisers and realtors and others that do this kind of work. But they even if you don't get a reduction, at least it was a fair amount of tax. Because if you go in for your little meeting and it is unfair, and you can argue that, you have to have you got to show other properties that are similar to yours but are assessed at a lower value than what you were appraised at. Okay. Uh, so no, that's kind of how that works. But if you're curious about that, that's something you do in mid-spring. Okay.
Welcome. We're so glad to see you. We want to help as many people as possible to get started in their real estate career. If you like what you see in these videos, be sure to show our instructors that you appreciate them by giving them a like. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss a single one of our topics, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Guess what? We have helped more students successfully start their real estate career than any other school that we have stats for. If you want to get in on that action, go to the description, click on the Prep My Exam link. We have audio reviews, we have thousands of practice questions, we've got an exam simulator, and we've got a little secret surprise that might be your golden ticket to starting your real estate career right. So go ahead and click the link, and we'll see you there.
Let's look at number 2, please. Well, which one are we on? Yeah, we're on number 2. All right. Jeff paid $675 in property tax. It's pretty cheap. If the tax rate is 2 mills, remember that mathematically would be 0.002, and the assessment rate's 75%, what's the appraised value of the home? Now, when you're looking at something like this, you got to think very clearly. Okay, what are they giving me, and what do I need to solve for? They want to know what the appraised value of the house was. Okay. And but to do that, we've got to work this backwards. Now, tax due divided by the tax rate gives you the assessed value, and then you take that and divide that by the assessment rate, and that'll give you the appraised value. So it's a similar formula, uh, but if you're working from the bottom up, you're going to be dividing. If you're working from the top down, you're going to be multiplying. And in this one, um, let's plug in what we've got. Okay. And we know what tax due is, right? It's $675. And we know what the tax rate is. It's 0.002, and or the mill levy, and the tax rate is 75%, so let's plug it in the formula. Okay, so the tax due was $675. Tax rate was 0.002, was 2 mils. Remember, a mil is 0.001. Now, if it was a penny, it would be 0.01, right? But a mil is a tenth of a cent. So we go one more space over, and it's 2 mils. So the assessed value, well, in order to solve for that, we divide the one above, but the number above by the one below, and that gives us 337,500. And our rate was assessment rate was throw it up there. I got it right here. Anyway, it's it was 75%, so it'll be 0.75. Okay, so now we divide the one, above it by the one below it, and that gives us 450,000. Now, what are we looking at here? We're looking at the appraised value. So the tax assessor came out and said, well, we think it's worth 525,000, and you go in and you challenge that in the spring, and you say, no, here's some other comps in my neighborhood that are just like my house. In fact, they built the same time, same builder, same plan, and we think, it's not worth 5.25. These are all selling for, one sold for 460, one sold for 435, one sold for 450, and they're going to say, yeah, we may have been a little aggressive on that $500,000 plus figure, and they'll probably lower it down for you. And then next year they'll kick it back up again, and because one of the ways that they can make more tax revenue is by being very optimistic on the assessments. So you got to watch them, and if you go in, what they're going to want to see is another appraisal done by a licensed appraiser. That would be the best evidence, but a lot of times you can just take in comparables and show them homes that are just like yours that sold for less than what they thought yours was worth. And sometimes it's worth doing, sometimes it's not. Okay. If you're an agent and you know that there's a subdivision where there's been kind of a tumbling of prices, that might be a good one to help the people lower their tax rate, and then putting them in your database for future client possibilities and helping them sell their home and move and buying another one. You want to be their realtor, help them get their taxes down. You can even charge for that if you wanted to. Talk to your broker about that and how that would work. Some brokers say, well, it's just a little extra pin money, I don't care about that. And other brokers say, well, I want my 10% right off the top. So, but that's, you work that out with them. Get it in writing too, by the way. Let's look at our next question. Here we go. Okay, number 3 says, Kay has an investment property that they would like to list. Ooh, cool. They currently earn $10,000 per month in rent, and expenses include $5,000 in maintenance and $300 in tenant improvements. At a cap rate of 6%, what would the listing price of this property be? Now, when you're working cap rates, that's a way that we find out the value of commercial properties, because commercial properties should be worth what their cash flow is. But when we're looking at cash flows on commercial properties, we're looking at net income, net operating income. So this one gave us the gross operating income, which was $10,000 per month, but it had expenses. So you take your gross operating income and you take off the expenses of $5,000 in maintenance and $300 in tenant improvements, and that would give you NOI, net operating income. And then we would take the net operating income and we would use the cap rate, which was appropriate for this type of property, based on what others are selling. I mean, where do appraisers come up with the cap rates? Well, they analyze previous sales. So if you've got a fourplex in the same area, they're going to try to find fourplex sales and then run the math on those to calculate, you know, what is the cap rate that these properties are selling for. And you have one that was 6.25, another one was 5.75, another one was 5%, or, you know, I mean, you know, but that one was really rough shape and whatnot. So, you know, and this is what appraisers talk about when they go to lunch, you know, I mean, and you should take your appraiser friend to lunch, because it's invaluable to say, you know, hey, Bill or Susan, you know, I'm on my way out to look at a house in Riverton that's been rented, or a duplex or a fourplex in Riverton that's been rented. What are you guys using for a cap rate out in Riverton right now? Well, right now I'm using 6.5. Another appraiser friend says, well, I think 6 is fair, you know. You know, it's great to have appraiser friends, because you know they'll tell you, you know. So you know, nobody ever takes them to lunch. You just take them to lunch. Okay, get to know them, be a friend. They can save you a lot of time. So on this problem, let's do some math. Let's set it up. What's the listing value? That's what we're trying to solve for. The other numbers we have are 10,000 per month. Now, do we use monthly rents or do we use annual rents? We use annual rents, okay? And these expenses are, you know, are there too. So let's run the math out, okay? So what we're looking at this one is we've got an annual net income. Well, how do we get that? Well, 10,000 minus 5,300, you add that up, $5,300, would give you the NOI, the annual net income, okay? And so that's the figure we're going to work with the cap rate, which is 3%, or 6%. Not, it's $300, but was the expense. So this one, that's monthly income, and you got to be annual, 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 annual. Cap rates are always what? Annual, annual. Now, if you forget that during the test, you just go like that. Someone else will go annual, because I've already hypnotized them. Okay. The proctors won't like that, so don't really do that. So anyway, you've got your 10 grand minus 52 or 5,300 gives you 4,700. That's monthly times 12 will give you 56,000 annual income. Okay. So now what do we do? Well, we take our annual income and we divide it by the cap rate. 940,000. Okay. Nice listing, by the way. You know, that'd be a good one. So you can get information on what other properties are selling for on the MLS. The problem is sometimes on the income producing properties, they're supposed to put income statements and whatnot with those properties in the MLS, but sometimes they don't have that accurate figure. And that's where having a good appraisal buddy really comes in handy, because you could tell them, you know, I've got this fourplex out in Riverton. What's a good cap rate out there? Well, 6.5 is what I've been using. You know, that it, see how helpful that is? Well, anyway, now let's, so, you know, go ahead and get your $940,000 listing, and then let's go to the next problem. Number 4, P has a property which is making $33,000 net. Okay, annual income. Okay, they want to sell the property. Their agent has found a comparable property. It's making $40,000 annually, sold for $1 million. What should the agent recommend to P for a listing price in his property? Well, how are we going to figure this out? Well, you know, the incomes aren't that different. You know, there's 3,300 or 33,000, 40,000, and maybe the properties are quite similar. I don't know, but we're going to figure it out with using cap rates. Okay. So this agent found a comparable listing for $40,000 annually and sold for $1 million recently. So do we work on annual or do we work on monthly? We work on annual. So we're going to have to take that $40,000 and make it annual, aren't we? So when we're setting up our numbers underneath the problem here, what becomes real important, show the numbers please, is the listing price, right? The annual net income, and of course, this comparable, their annual net income, and what it actually sold for. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the one we know about, the one that did actually sell and close. Maybe it closed just a few weeks ago. That's a very current comp. Maybe the buildings are, fairly close in age and condition and maybe even size. Or, one might be a fourplex, one might be a fiveplex, but the more the comparable you're using is like the subject property, the more valid it is. But nevertheless, let's look at this. So what's our annual income? P as a property is making 33,000, but the comp we know about that actually sold, it's making 40,000. So we put that value in, and then we divide that by what it sold for, which we found in the MLS or found from our appraisal friend. And we divide the 40,000 by $1 million, and we come up with a 4% cap rate. Now, if we're comfortable with that, if our appraiser buddy says, yeah, maybe 4, maybe 4.5, maybe, you know, maybe 3 3/4, so get some verification on that. Now we're going to look at our other property. So more numbers, please. We will say we have an annual income of 33,000, and our cap rate based on the comparable that we found is 4% for properties that are similar. Then we divide this into that, and that tells us that this one is worth about 825K. The other one was a little bit bigger, a little nicer. Maybe one's a little smaller or less nice, or maybe older, or maybe not in as good a shape. Remember, appraisals are not scientific. There is a method that you use, but they're artwork. And some of these you paint with acrylics, and some of you paint with watercolors. You're going to come up with a little different result. Some of these you think are finger painting, but this is how they do it. And the more comps they find that are similar, if they're very close, and they're close in construction, or one isn't made out of wood, another made out of brick, they take all this into consideration. But just based on the income, should be about 8.25. Nice listing. Okay. Next one, please.
Question, is the cap rate usually disclosed in the listing?
Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but it's easy to figure out because usually they will give you the net income the property is producing, or they'll give you the gross income and they'll give you the expenses. And so you can figure it out. But see, another way of looking at this, if your investor said, Linda, if they said, well, what should I offer? And you said, well, I've been talking to some of my appraiser buddies, and properties in the Riverton area are going for about 4% cap. Okay. So, you take the income and you figure out, well, based on this, we should offer around 8.25. Okay. And maybe they'll take it, maybe they won't, but it won't do you much good to put a property under contract and then, for $1 million, and it won't appraise for, only appraises for 825. Because the banks aren't going to lend you a whole, they're not going to lend you the $1 million. They'll say, hey, you want to pay the difference? We'll base our loan off the 825. But these are things you assume and you figure out, but they're not difficult if you can get the figures. But the most important figure, probably one of the hardest ones, you should take an appraiser to lunch, and you should have an appraiser friend. Okay. Someone that works that area, or maybe works all over the valley. A lot of them are working all over the valley, but cap rate for Riverton might be a little different than the cap rate for Draper. Okay. Cap rate in Draper might be a little smaller, or maybe it could be a little larger depending on how much rent you can get out of that property and what the expenses are. Okay. Was that a long-winded answer? Did that help? Silence on the other side. Okay, Linda, you still here? All right, let's look at the next one.
Yes, it was great. Thanks.
Okay, like I said, this is fun with numbers. Okay, F is building a new home, and they have laid out the foundation, which is 30 yards by 15 yards. And if their home will be 2 stories with a 10-foot vaulted ceiling, how many square feet of living space will they have? Now, if we're looking just for square feet of living space, or are we looking for cubic feet of living space? Cubic feet is that 3-dimensional thing. And with the 10-foot ceilings, it's going to have a more cubic space than a home that had an 8-foot ceiling or a 9-foot ceiling, because there's just more empty space up there in the ceiling. And but that's really not where we're going with this question, because they just want to know the square feet of living space. And that's the trick here. You've got to look at these questions and say, well, what are they really looking for here? All right, well, they're not looking for cubic feet, so I really don't care if it has a 10-foot vaulted ceiling. They're only looking for what? Square feet, which is length times width, okay? And usually we're looking for square feet in square feet, you know? So this is talking about yards, okay? So the 10-foot ceiling really doesn't matter, okay? But it's 2 stories, okay? So assuming there's no cantilever, where the upper sticks out 2 feet further than the lower, because it doesn't say that. So we're assuming that it's just a straight up 2-story with no cantilevers, which would make the second floor larger than the first floor by a little bit. And so let's look at the length. The length then we have is 30 yards by 3 feet. Now, why 3 feet? Because that's what our answer is in. So we want to convert that as quickly as we can. It's going to be 90 feet, and the width is 15 yards by 3 feet, 45 feet, which gives us an area of, survey says, 4,050 square feet. Okay. Now, is that all of it? Well, the vaulted ceilings really don't matter. Okay, but the foundation's 30 by 15. So how much living space are they going to have? Is it going to be 4,050 or is it going to be more? What do you think? It's going to be more. Why? Because it's a 2-story. You have to take into consideration that's 4,050 feet per 1 floor, and then it's a 2-story. So there's another 40,050 feet. And a lot of times, like I said, these are cantilevered another 18 inches or maybe even 2 feet out. So the upper floor is or maybe there's a little bump out, like a little sitting area in the living room. So you have to take that into consideration as well. What we do when we're out trying to figure out square footage of houses, we just go by what the county assessor said it had. And that way we can blame it on someone else if they weren't accurate, but or it's a lot faster too. But if it doesn't feel right, you can actually measure it. Sometimes the owners have had an appraisal, or they still have the appraisal that they got or received when they bought the home. And the appraisers, they generally measure every house with a tape measure. So that would be another source, would be an appraisal. And some people have refinanced their house a few years ago, so they have another appraisal. If they've got the original appraisal when they bought the home and they've got a refi appraisal, that would be fun, particularly if it's 2 different appraisers. You can check to see if they both agreed on the square footage. And you can also check the public record as well. Okay. Cool. Let's go to number 6. Yeah, property lot is rectangular. Okay, it's kind of square with wider dimensions on a couple of sides. And it's 200 feet deep, and the total area of the property is 42,000 square feet. How many yards of frontage does the property have? Okay. All right, so the lot's rectangular, but it's 200 feet deep, okay? So that means if it's 42,000 square feet, there's another dimension. So what is that dimension going to be? Well, area divided by length or depth in this case. So what is our area? Well, it's 42,000. Okay. And you have the depth, which is what tells you in frontage, right? Okay, it's 200 feet deep. That's the depth. Okay, and so if we want to know what the frontage is, well, we'd have to take the total square footage divided by 200, and that would give us our other dimension, which, as you can see from the illustration here, is going to be a little bit more footage than the depth. It would have to be, to get to 42,000. So let's do the math. The area was 42,000. Okay, and it was 200 on the depth that, that's one dimension they gave you. So the width would have to be 210 feet. Okay, it's almost square. Kind of cool. But they wanted to know about yards. So you're not done yet. You got to take the 21 square feet and divide it by 3, because a yardstick is bigger than a 1-foot ruler. The yardstick is 3 feet. Okay. So if you're looking at yards, you got to divide that in order to get our width, 70 yards frontage. Okay. Go back a slide, Dan. So where would that be? Well, it'd be on the frontage, that part that's on the road. Also sometimes called the front foot. So you might see front foot, you might see frontage, but makes sense. It's your front yard. It's the amount of, if it was on a corner, you might have frontage on 2 roads, which would be kind of interesting. You have to, think about that, especially if it's assessment time and you're replacing or putting in a sidewalk and curb and gutter. they're going to hit you for the frontage in front of your house, and they're going to hit you on the side because there's another street there as well. But hey, you have one less neighbor on that side. It's kind of cool. Let's go to number 7, please. This is a loan to value problem. Okay, H bought a property, excuse me, for a couple $100,000 with a down payment of 30,000. That's a nice down payment on a $200,000 place. Anyway, it's been making payments on the property for 10 years. Now, 10 years later, their property's appreciated in value by 30%, and their current loan balance is 117. What is their current loan to value ratio? Now, they can't just give you the starting loan amount, which was $170,000. Because in the payment that you're making, there's an amortization schedule, and so these properties are amortized. So your monthly payment stays the same, but the amount of money that goes towards the interest lowers, and with each consecutive payment, the amount of money goes to the principal rises up. So your payment stays the same, but the distribution of that payment between interest paid to the bank and principal paid to the bank changes, and over time, which is a great argument if you can assume a loan. If there's a 15-year loan on a property and they've owned it for 7 or 8 years, and you can assume that loan because you have enough money, that from the sale of your other property put down on this one, heck, you might get a 4.5% locked in rate. But the other thing you'll get is that more of your payment will go to the principal, because even though the payment stays the same, the principal reduction goes ever up, goes ever so slightly up with each monthly payment until you get down to the end of the loan. If you're halfway through a 15-year loan, 7.5 years or so, or whatever, more of that is going to go to principal because you paid off the interest, and as you are reducing that principal, that monthly payment of interest is based on the previous balance after the principal reduction on the other payment. So, assuming a loan that is aged is a great thing if you have the money to get down. And sometimes the interest rates are a little better than what you can currently get, because we did have some lower rates here a few years ago, and those homes are turning over now. So different ways of looking at things. Okay. The easiest way to pay off your house, buy 3. One you're going to live in and 2 you're going to rent. Let them appreciate, you know, let them go up in value, fix them up a little bit, rent them out, get the tax reductions, you know, but at some point in the future, uh, those properties are going to go up, and you sell those 2, and hopefully you make enough money on those 2, you know, to pay off the one loan on yours. Okay. It's just a waiting game and being a property manager for a while, or hiring a property manager. But if you have the dough, you don't just buy 1, buy 3. If you could buy 4, you'd be better. Look at number 8, please. Oh, wait a minute. Did we show the math on this one, Dan? Bought a home for 200
Not
grand
yet.
down.
Let's run through it.
Okay, let's run through it. Okay, so we had a $170,000 loan, right? Guys, loan amount, home value, ratio. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the current balance on the loan, you know, it went up 30%, okay? And their current balance is 117. They had to tell us the 117 because you don't have an amortization schedule with you, and it'd be very difficult to do the payoff. You could use this calculator to do the payoff, but you know you'd have to have all the dates and everything. They don't give you that much information, so they give you the loan balance. You don't have to figure that out. So what we're looking at here is you bought the property for 200. You had a down payment of 30,000, which means that it's 10 years later. Property's appreciated by 30%. So what is the current value? If it's appreciated by 30%, you'd take what the current value would be 200,000 times, you know, with an additional 30%. So all of it when they bought it would be 100, right? And the other 30 it went up would be 30. So you take what they paid for it times 130%. They gave you all that information in the stem of the question, which was great. But it's now worth 260. Okay, so that's important to know, right? Then you want to know what your current loan amount is, which is, they gave you that as well, which is 117. But you put the value of 260 in, you divide the one above the line by the one below the line, you have a 45% loan to value ratio, which is pretty good. Yeah, that's cool. Why? Well, for one thing, it went up 30%. You know, that was big. And you've paid it down a little bit after a number of years. So, you know, you get the value of the increase, which was 30%, and then you had a little bit of loan payoff. So that's why the current value of 260 divided into what your current loan balance is tells you have a 45% loan to value ratio. Good on you. Better to have a 0. But the best way to get there is, like I said, you know, don't buy 1 house, buy 3. Okay, let's look at the next problem, please. C's trying to qualify for a loan. Cool. I always get my people qualified before I put them in my car to go look at properties. I don't want to be showing them homes if my lender friends say that they can't get a loan. I mean, you know, so this is the first step you ought to do. Anyway, due to their current credit, they can only purchase using a conventional loan with a maximum of 80% down loan to value. And if they can make a down payment of $45,000, what's the maximum value of property that they can buy? Okay, well, a little figuring here. They can only purchase using a maximum 80% loan to value. So using the value of the property, well, we don't know what that is. We got to figure it out. But they can make a $45,000 down payment, right? So let's run some numbers here. We know their down payment can be $45,000, right? We know that their ratio is 80% loan to value. So how much of a home can they buy? Well, looking at our little schematic here below, our down payment is $45,000, and our loan to value ratio is 80%. So we divide the one above the line by the one below the line, and we come up with figures that look like this. With our 20% down, okay, our down payment, my ratio, 20% down, home value, $45,000 down, 20% divided into that, $225,000, which we looked at previously. Okay, that's the value that we could get. Okay. Now that's what we're looking for, wasn't it? How much house can we buy? Right, Dan? Yeah. All right. So moving along. Here's an investor that purchased a fourplex for 550 grand. That's about, you can get a fourplex for around 5 or 6, depending on where it is, but they're a great investment to have. And one of my very first buyers I ran into that bought many properties from me was Roger Mayland, and we got him into a fourplex, and I don't remember how much it was a lot less back in those days. But anyway, he got his first fourplex that he bought on a VA loan. He was a veteran. He'd never used his eligibility, and they allowed him to live in one unit and then rent out the other 3. Well, the rents he got out of the other 3 units of his fourplex that he bought, paid for, was enough actually to, he could live free, in that property. Or he could pay himself the rent and whatever he wanted to do, depending on how he structured the whole thing. But they bought the fourplex for 550, but they'll sell it as soon as they realize a 20% gain. At what price do they hope to sell the property? Well, they bought it for 550. Okay, that's 100% of what they paid. If they want to realize a 20% gain, then they want everything they paid plus 20% gain, or they want to make 120% out of this deal, right? So if they bought it for 550, we got to take that number they purchased us for, and we're trying to solve for a price. What it'll include what they paid for plus 20%. So let's take the old value, and looking at these different formulas, let's put the numbers in. With the gain or loss, the percentage gain would be 20% or 0.20, and then the old value would be what they paid for it, which is 550. So we multiply it to 550, and that would mean we want a gain of $110,000. So what do we got to sell it for? Well, not considering closing costs and commissions and whatnot, because that just wasn't part of the discussion on this one. They just want to get close to what I'd have to get every property is going to have expenses of sale, but you add those two together, and if we got 660, we'd be in good shape, close to that 20%. That would be 20%, but then we're going to have some expenses exiting the property, so they'll make a little bit less, but not a lot less. Okay, got to sell for 660. Okay, are you following us, Linda? You're getting these?
Yes, sorry, I'm muted.
That's okay. You can unmute. That's fine. Just don't yell at the kids or stuff. Just teasing. No, I'm not teasing. All right, look at
You
the
mean the grandkids?
No, we don't yell at grandkids. They're too precious. Okay. Let's look at the next slide, please. Here we have a homeowner that wants to move to a new city. Great. Okay, we like people that like to move. And they know that they will need a down payment of 80 grand to purchase the house they want. So they currently owe $215 on their current mortgage. If a real estate agent wants to help them sell their house, and they want a 5% commission, and what will the sale price of the home be needed to recover enough money for their down payment? Now, in addition to the commission, there's going to be some other closing costs, but we're not being that picky on this deal. So, well, let's figure this out. They need a down payment of 80 grand, and they owe 215, and so we're going to have to add 80 grand onto the 215, but then we're going to have to add the commission in as well. Well, how are we going to do that? We're going to have to divide it in. So let's do some math. 80 grand plus the 215 gives us 295. Okay. But that's not everything. That's what they want to net, but they're going to have to pay 5% for at least the commission. There are going to be some other closing costs, maybe 2 or 3%, but we're not getting that detailed here. So if so the 295 needs to be the net, not the gross. Okay. So we take the 295 and divide it by the percentage it represents. Well, why is it 95%? Well, because there's a 5% commission. Whatever this mystery number is, it's going to include that 5% commission. And that means the 295, will be without the commission. So we now take the 295 and we divide it by the percentage it represents of the number it needs to sell for. And that's going to be, drum roll, hit the button on the calculator, $310,527. So I would probably list it for 311.5 or something like that. Give you some negotiating room. Whatever. And then, if they come in and they say, well, I won't give you 315, but I'll give you three, whatever it would take. So, well, and it won't exactly come out with the way they want because of some of the closing cost. Okay. What you can do, on this whole closing cost thing, and I recommend to agents, is that they get a little 3-ring binder notebook, and they go to their favorite title company and they say, I want you to give me some mock settlement statements that have the typical cost of a sale. And I want one at, well, if we're taking these figures here, I want one at 300. I want one at 325, 350. I want one at 450, 500, 550, whatever. Okay. And they can just run them off on their computer. It's no big deal. And then you put these into plastic sheets and put them in your little 3-ring binder. And that gives you roughly the closing cost, because the closing cost between maybe 500 and 525 isn't that big a deal, but maybe 500 and 550 might be. But you've got these different figures, so you can kind of show them. Well, if we sold it for about this figure, let me show you what the typical closing costs are. And here they are. And that's one way to do it. And then they're able to look at some numbers. Of course, you've got the 5% commission here. You've got, but there's other cost. There's recording cost and all kinds of things. But if you have a settlement sheet from the title company, a mock one, it'll have all those figures on there. Now, and that's for the guy that's just really into numbers. The engineers are going to be listing their homes, and the accountants and that type of people. They're not going to be happy with just a ballpark. Most people, you could go in and just give them a ballpark. Well, there's commissions 5%, and usually other closing costs are around 3%. So it's going to be 8%. So we're going to take 9,200 and multiply it back. And you should sell about this. It's not going to satisfy an accountant. He wants to see the figures. It will satisfy all the touchy-feely people that got into social work, that kind of thing, because they just want a ballpark. And we'll look at the figures, and then you'll talk about your hobbies for the next half hour, and then you'll get the listing and leave. Okay, or their hobbies. Any questions on this one? See how you have to work it back into it, by dividing. Okay, you divide the number by the number the percentage it would represent of the whole. If it's a 6% commission, you'd be dividing by 0.94. Or if you're only charging 3, 0.97. Okay. Next question, please. Well, this is label number 1, Dan. What
Yeah, it's probably number 11. I'll fix that in a little while.
Okay, a buyer bought has a new 40-year loan on their property. Are they doing 40 years now? I heard they were in some cases, rare cases, but
Yeah, a few rare cases, but I think it's still mostly 30.
yeah, it's people trying to squeeze in the house they can't afford. I don't know, but they got to have it, so that's up to them. But a 40-year loan on their own loan, a total of $480,000 with a 4% interest rate. Taxes are $2,100, and they're currently paying $1,500 in insurance. What would their balance be after their first payment? Now, the only way you configure this is you have to have the loan balance starting, and they gave it to you. Why? Because it's the first payment. Payment hasn't been made yet. Okay. So we're going to have to do some calculating here to figure out how much of what the loan balance will be after the first payment. Okay. And how much is the payment? Well, it tells you right in the problem. It's $2,500. Okay. But it gives you all these other figures we need to add in. But out of that payment, we're going to have the monthly principal plus the interest plus the taxes and the monthly insurance. And that'll give us our total payment. Let's figure the loan out first. Our total loan value is it's $2,100 divided by 12. Give you monthly taxes, figuring the taxes first, would be 175, and monthly insurance 125 because they gave you an annual figure. So the loan is 48,000 times 4%. That's annual. Divide that by 12. That's 1,600. So our PITI payment will be 1,600 plus 125. Well, plus $300, right? Because those are monthly. Okay. So we take our tax assurance, monthly interest. We're going to come up with $600 principal reduction. Huh. Okay, so we have 48 minus the $600. So we're going to have a principal reduction of $600. So our loan just went down $600. Our payment was $2,500. But that's paying the taxes, and that's paying the insurance. That's just a couple of the costs you're definitely going to have. So, the loan balance only went down $600. And that'll change each month because the payment will be, the payment will remain constant. It'll be $2,500. But what will change is how much of that $2,500 went to the principal reduction and how much of that $2,500 went to the interest portion. And obviously, even though it's ever so small in the beginning, as you whittle down this loan, particularly if it's a 15-year loan instead of a 30 or 45 or a 40 or 35, a 15-year loan will get you home a lot quicker. I don't know. My parents bought a house in Loveland, Colorado. It was, real estate doesn't always go up. Sometimes you get into a recessionary market. And they sold that house about 10 years after they'd lived there, and they sold it for exactly what they paid for it. It's crazy. But when they bought the house, I had a long discussion with my dad, and do you want to go a 15-year loan or a 30-year loan? Because he could have easily afforded a 15-year loan. Well, the price of the home didn't go up. It was recessionary time, and they sold for what they paid for. But they lost a little bit of dough because they got a 30-year loan and it hadn't paid down very much. Had they had the 15-year loan, they would have at least walked away with a little equity. But they would have paid for it in the sense. But he was making good money. I mean, the interest on the additional interest on a 15-year loan, would actually just give him a better tax reduction. So in retrospect, he agreed. And so going forward after that one, he only got 15-year loans. You just build equity. And if you can afford it, go on a smaller amortization because it'll pay it off quicker and you'll have a lot more equity. And you'll protect yourself against a time when maybe the market slid back. At least you'll walk away with something instead of breaking even or having to come in to a closing with money. Things you should consider. But generally speaking, houses go up in value, money goes down in value. So it's kind of working both sides against the middle. Number 12, a homeowner has a monthly payment of $1,500. Their next payment includes $1,100 in interest on a 5% loan. What the heck is their loan balance? Well, if the total payment's $1,500, what's key here? What's key is the $1,100 in interest. Now their payments stay the same. So how much did they pay against the principal? And it's a 5% loan. Okay. So let's look at the math. their next payment will be $1,100 in interest. That's a monthly figure, but it's an annual payment, but it's an APR, annual percentage rate. So let's look at 12 times that. So it's 13,200 in annual interest. Okay. And that's 5% interest rate, which would give us the interest for what? We'll apply it out, and it's, what are we looking for here? Give us our loan balance of $264,000. Okay. Going into that payment. Okay. Now, that won't work except for this one time, because the payment is $1,500. So that means there's going to be about a $400 principal reduction, maybe, if it's just a PI payment. Or that $1,500 payment could be principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, meaning there's two escrows, which would mean a smaller amount of money would go against the principal reduction. Most payments are PITI. Not all of them. If you put down 20%, they may not require that. And they may. It just depends on what's happening in the lending market at that particular time. But you can see how you figure the loan balance. You have to figure out what the interest would be, and then that'll give you your loan balance. Well, my friends, that was fun with math. Now we have a lot of different math practices that you can work on. And I even have a little math review that if you're interested in getting it, if any of you want it, just get a hold of me. My number is 801-556-8000, and it has different math problems. I just email it out to you. And then we have other math problems, and we actually have another math class that you can take at the school. And of course, we're always available if you want to work some math problems one of these nights. Just give me a call. We'll work them on the phone, whatever, What a fun evening, right? It's a lot more fun when we're figuring commissions. Okay, and I'll show you some things about that would be kind of fun too. We appreciate you being here. This is the best school in the whole state of Utah. And you can easily get a hold of Dan. You can easily get a hold of me. We're happy to help any way that we can. One of the fears I have keeps me up at night is that you have a question about one little thing and you spend 45 minutes trying to find it in the manual. It keeps me up at night. Don't do that. Pick up the darn phone and give me a call. We'll have a quality 4-minute call and you'll get it. Okay. And we want you to pass the exam the first time. We don't want you to screw up our stats. Okay. So appreciate you being here. This is going to be a fun ride. During recessionary times, people need good agents. They need good agents that are good on pricing, that are realistic on pricing. People are still getting divorced. They're still getting married. They're still getting jobs across state. They got to move, or they need to dump one of their investment properties, because they want to do something else. I mean, but during times when, interest is low and loans are easy to get, and, maybe a for sale by owner works occasionally. I still think that, that there's so many ways that a FSBO can be taken advantage of, for sale by owner can be taken advantage of. They need their own agent. To make sure that things are done correctly and that everyone's treated fairly. So, good times, bad times. It's always the realtor's market. But during recessionary times, they need you anymore because there's more properties for sale and less buyers. So we're entering into a very fun market. I don't care if it's a buyer's market or if it's a seller's market. It's always a realtor's market. Appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you, Dan, for doing the legwork here, the technical work, and Linda, get out there and make it happen, okay?
Thank you.
Whoever else watches this in the future, we appreciate you, and these are for your benefit, but you can also call us as well. My number 801-556-8000. It's my secret cell phone number. Catch you later, guys. Have a nice evening.
Thanks for joining us today. You are taking the right steps to get started on your real estate career, and we're proud of you. If you want to make sure you don't miss a single one of our videos, go ahead and subscribe to our channel right now. And if you want to show our instructors that you appreciate them, give them a virtual high five. Click that like button. If you want to join us for our Prep My Exam reviews that include all the tools you'll need to get started in real estate on the right foot, go ahead and click the link in the description, and we'll see you there.